This is Ed Stewart, the curator here at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. In this series, Ed's going to be taking a look at various ships in sci-fi and talking about how they might work in the real world. For our first episode, Ed's going to be looking at ships from Star Wars: A New Hope.
Okay, the Tantive 4. So a Corvette or a blockade runner. Very cool design of a ship. I have a 3.5 foot long Lego model of one at my house. Don't judge me. So most of the Rebel ships, I think almost all the ships in Star Wars are powered by fusion engines of some kind or a fusion reactor. And this one I think uses like a fusion propulsion system. Most of the Rebel ships tend to lean in that direction. Fusion propulsion isn't a thing in the real world, at least not yet anyways. Maybe conceivably you could do something like that, but that type of propulsion system, the closest you could come to it is a fission engine that we had once upon a time called NERVA, Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Applications, which was more efficient and more powerful than a combustion chemical rocket engine. But it was definitely fission, so splitting atoms apart, and not fusion powered. And they were using fission to heat gas so that then gas would get pushed out of a rocket engine and a rocket nozzle and it would propel it forward. So very different technologies, but kind of the closest thing we have in the real world. Since we just got some experimental success with fusion, maybe in 100 years we might see something with the fusion powered engine, but right now there's really not anything. Most of the time we see it fly in a straight line, which is good because it doesn't seem to have any engines other than the ones in the back, and that would be good for that. Maybe you could gimbal them or vector the thrust somehow, but real world performance, not so great. In universe performance, pretty good unless you're being chased by a Star Destroyer. Which brings us to the Star Destroyer, which, if I remember right, in A New Hope, that's the Devastator at the beginning, and it has on the back a whole series of very large blue glowy engines that, if I remember right, are ion propulsion, and that seems to be like the favorite version of propulsion for the Empire. And so ion propulsion is sort of an electricity and a charged gas propulsion system. It exists in the real world, and it's been used on space stations. It's been used on a lot of satellites. There's an electric propulsion system that's going to be used on the Gateway module as part of the Artemis program. So the technology definitely exists. Could you power a multi-kilometer long ship full of other ships and thousands upon thousands of people? Theoretically, yes, as long as you weren't planning on going anywhere anytime soon. Because real-world ion propulsion just does very minute amounts of thrust. Where it has an advantage is it's tiny amounts of thrust, but constant over a long period of time. So you can go really fast. You just have to wait a long time to get up to speed, so your acceleration rate is very slow. It does kind of fit with sort of how they feel in the films, because you see these ships and they're not zooming across the screen, right? They're just these large, sort of like battleship analogs that just sort of plod slowly, which adds a little bit to the menace, I think, of it in the film. But I don't know with what we've got on ion propulsion or electric propulsion right now. Definitely not suitable for moving large ships around very far at any kind of speed whatsoever. Maybe sometime in the future, but definitely not there yet. Oh, the Death Star. I don't know what kind of, well, it probably has an ion-based propulsion system. What I can tell you is an object that big would probably like to have its own orbit around a planet, and could just use basic, gravity to sort of keep itself in place. but the Death Stars are definitely mobile. So I'm going to go with magic on that one, because definitely we don't have any kind of propulsion system in the real world that could move an object of that sort of size and mass. So again, you could put huge banks of ion engines on there and move it really slowly. But it would almost maybe be more of like a station keeping function as opposed to like moving from point A to point B. So I'm going to go with my first answer of magic. The TIE Fighter, the twin ion engine. This is definitely the most blatant, like, known technology call out in all of the Star Wars ships. It's an ion-based propulsion system. The TIEs, except for very special, rare exceptions, don't have a hyperdrive system, so they're sort of like short-range fighters, which is kind of cool. It goes back to that sort of the aircraft carrier philosophy that like the Empire seems to have with their capital ships. And again, ion propulsion, definitely a real thing, definitely works in real life, but at least currently we don't have the kind of oomph in our ion engines that would be required for like propelling something in sort of a dogfighting combat situation like you see them doing. The other thing too is I know TIEs fly in atmosphere, and that is probably one of the least aerodynamic ships I have ever seen, short of like a lunar lander. But the lunar landers weren't designed to fly in atmosphere, so that didn't matter in that case. If I remember right, except for rare exceptions, TIEs don't have a deflector system, which in some sci-fi universes they use the deflector as a way to get around the bad aerodynamics, and those don't have that. So that is, as they perform in the films, kind of a disaster of a ship, but cool to look at. The YT-1300 Corellian freighter, also known as the Millennium Falcon. So I'm not 100% familiar with what the propulsion technology is that they use on the Falcon, but I believe it's ion related. The thing that I think is cool about the Falcon is you have one big bank of engines across the back of the sort of saucer-shaped part of the body, and that provides, theoretically a lot of thrust in one direction. But one thing you never see in Star Wars ships, especially, not especially, you don't ever see it on any of the Star Wars ships, is any kind of like maneuvering thrusters. So maneuvering is almost always going to be left up to thrust vectoring. So taking your exhaust plume of whatever your exhaust is and pointing it in different directions, or inserting something into the exhaust stream and kind of maneuvering it around. That is a thing that happens in the real world, and you can see it happen in some of the films. On the Falcon, there's these louvers that sort of kind of close down over the back of the exhaust ports on the propulsion band that goes across the back. And it's a whole series of them, as opposed to like one big one on each side, top and bottom. And so theoretically, if you have really good thrust vector control system, you could get some of the like spins and all the moves that you see the ship doing in the films just by like restricting thrust on one side of the engine and opening it up on the other. So depending on exactly what that propulsion technology is, you could maneuver like that. But again, if it's ion-based, you're really not going to be going that fast. But there's some like definitely some real-world ideas involved in how you could maneuver around without like reaction control thrusters. Oh, and the X-Wing. Oh man, so that's another fusion-based propulsion system. And it's got 4 engines on each, one on each of the wings. And they do have, if you look at them, they look a lot like sort of traditional jet engines. If you take an engine out of an F-14 and you kind of put it next to one of the engine nacelles on an X-Wing, they have a very similar kind of look to them, especially the end where the exhaust nozzle is. And it definitely looks like you would do your maneuvering with thrust vectoring, either by kind of pitching the sort of pedals that make up the exhaust cone on the X-wings, and maybe like constricting it to provide you with a little more thrust. And then, like I said, either kind of pushing the pedals in different directions to give you thrust vectoring and everything. Now, this is another one where you really, with those 4 big engines like that, the kind of maneuvering that you see them doing, the sort of very acrobatic dog fighting kind of stuff, I don't know that you would ever be able to achieve that with the thrust vector control system that they have. But it's, you know, it's still a cool looking ship. As far as in atmosphere flight, because we see them frequently flying in atmosphere as well, it is probably one of the most well adapted for in atmosphere, because it has the sort of long sleep fuselage shape, and it does have sort of, I hesitate to call them wings because they don't seem to have the traditional wing shape with the curves and the trailing edges and everything. So still probably a disaster in atmosphere, but better than a TIE fighter by a long shot. Ooh, the Y-wing fighter bomber. That is one of the weirdest formats for a ship that really you could ever hope to see in your entire life. It has ginormous engines sticking off the sides on nacelles, which is a thoughtful design because it keeps the theoretical heat being produced by those engines away from your crew and your astromech, which probably doesn't appreciate being overheated. Again, another fusion-based propulsion system, so depending on exactly how that's powered, you really maybe could get a lot of oomph out of that, which is good for like strafing runs and bombing runs and stuff. From a maneuverability standpoint, the Y-wings definitely have inline thrust vectoring. So if you look at the back end of the engine nacelles, there's a sort of cross shape that is in the stream of the exhaust. Now it's way far away from the nozzle, which is a weird choice. But again, magical sort of propulsion system, so maybe that works in the Star Wars universe. And you would be able to kind of turn those fins in different directions to kind of make your thrust go in various ways. And with the Y-wings, they're never shown as like a really agile, sort of acrobatic kind of vehicle. So thrust vectoring for a vehicle that's going to do mostly straight lines and big curves is a very, I think, appropriate way to kind of approach that. So I would say from that standpoint, pretty solid. I think they do fly in atmosphere too. I can't ever imagine a way in which that would actually work in the real world, but you never know. They do have repulsor lifts too, which is a whole other thing that doesn't exist in the real world. So. Oh, Vader's tie. So one of the exceptions that does have a hyperdrive, and it does have a deflector system. On all the ties, they have the big sort of solar panel wings where you could theoretically gather up light energy to collect as electricity to power your ion engines. Lots of good surface area on Vader's tie versus the regular tie, in my opinion. So you'd probably be better at collecting it. The fun part about that is a lot of the battles that they do seem to take place in really deep space where there's not a ton of like heavy sunlight from one star. So I'm not sure how efficient they are, but maybe you've got a highly efficient solar panel that doesn't exist in our world, or at least not yet, that might collect items for that. In the real world, a terrible flying machine, but still would, if I saw one flying at me, I would definitely feel the sense of dread. So, but great ship designs visually. Practically speaking, not so much, but that has not stopped me from enjoying them my entire life. So a cool non-propulsion thing about the Y-wings The studio models that they built for the films were all kit bashed. So they took little pieces of model kits of cars, trains, spaceships, etc., and kind of amalgamated them together to sort of form what we now know as the Y-Wing, and all the other ships in the universe as well. But in particular, the Y-Wing has several identifiable pieces of a Saturn V model kit in it. And this particular model kit, built by a gentleman named Reed Shukart, is loaning it to us for the Space Craze exhibition. He has painted up this replica model of the red Y-Wing, and you can see where he's painted in, like on the right-hand nacelle, the starboard nacelle, he's painted it up as if it were the piece of the Saturn V. And then if you look, and of course that's sort of a stage and an inner stage with the rib section. If you look on the very top center, kind of where the shadow of my finger is right there, that is the LEM without any landing legs. It's a little bit sort of upside down from this perspective. Then when you come around to the back, inside the engine nacelle is sort of the aft section of the second stage of the Saturn V. And then at the very tip of the nacelle, there's a little tiny lunar module model built in as part of that. And we're pretty sure that the fins from the Saturn V make up that sort of back end of that sort of vane section in the middle of there. And there's also a piece of an F1 engine sort of tucked away in there somewhere as well, although that's a lot harder to spot because it's sort of built up and on top of. But I thought it was very cool that we could showcase sort of a piece like this that comes from the film that also has a connection, you know, in a fun way back to a real vehicle. So if you liked the Curator Reacts to Star Wars ships, let us know if you'd like us to tackle any other ships from Star Wars or any other science fiction franchise. Leave us a comment down below and tell us what you think, and let us know if there's something that we missed or left out. And like I said, anything you want to see us do in the future, give us your thoughts and we'll see what we can do.